With the onset of the Cold War, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly deteriorated. Both countries were vying for global dominance, each attempting to spread its ideology: capitalism for the US and communism for the Soviet Union. Cuba, located just 150 kilometers from the US coast, became a significant strategic point in this global competition. When Fidel Castro came to power in 1959 after a successful revolution, he quickly established a communist regime. This alarmed Washington, as Cuba had been a key ally to the U.S. in Latin America. After the revolution, the U.S. began limiting trade with Cuba and later imposed an economic blockade. In response, Castro sought closer ties with the Soviet Union, which began providing Cuba with economic and military assistance. This was seen as a direct challenge to the U.S., as Cuba became a communist stronghold so close to American shores. By the early 1960s, the situation was rapidly escalating. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, the U.S. government decided that more decisive action was needed. By that time, Soviet support for Cuba had become much more evident, making the threat even more pressing. Operation Mongoose. One of the key operations designed to counter the communist regime in Cuba was Operation Mongoose, led by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The operation was launched in November 1961, when President John F. Kennedy, concerned by the increasing Soviet presence in Cuba, tasked the agency with weakening the Castro regime and undermining its political, economic, and military base. The main objectives of the operation included undermining Cuba's political stability. The CIA worked to create anti-communist movements within the country that could destabilize Castro's regime. This involved using various covert networks, including Cuban exiles, who were to operate on the island and engage local citizens in sabotage and protests. Sabotage and diversions. A major component of the operation involved numerous sabotage activities aimed at destroying Cuba's infrastructure. These included attacks on oil refineries, factories, power stations, and food supply systems. The goal was to weaken the economy and create chaos in the country. However, sabotage was not always successful, and Cuba continued to function within its revolutionary plan. Economic blockade and isolation. The U.S. tried to constrain Cuba's economy by imposing various trade restrictions and financial sanctions. This also included attempts to block oil supplies, which were crucial to Cuba's economy. Propaganda war. A significant part of the operation was the dissemination of propaganda both within Cuba and abroad. The U.S. aimed to convince Cubans that their revolution had led to economic and social disaster, creating an image of a dictatorial and destructive regime that was supported by the USSR. This involved the use of radio broadcasts, leaflets, and even television and print media to discredit Cuba and Castro on the international stage. Support for anti-Castro forces. The CIA actively supported Cuban exiles and anti-communist groups operating against Castro's regime. This support included the provision of weapons, ammunition, and training for insurgents operating in Cuba. A key element of this support was strengthening groups attempting to organize armed uprisings inside the country. Attempts to eliminate Fidel Castro. One of the most scandalous and shocking aspects of the operation was the numerous attempts to assassinate Castro. These included the use of poisoned pills, cigars with toxic substances, and even plans to inject poison into his food. The CIA developed several eccentric and dangerous plans, but none succeeded. For many years, the Castro regime remained intact despite multiple assassination attempts. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the climax. However, the most dangerous moment arrived in October 1962, when the U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union was deploying medium-range missiles in Cuba. This meant that, in the event of war, these missiles could instantly reach major U.S. cities, including Washington and New York. Faced with this perilous situation, President Kennedy decided to act. He announced a naval blockade of Cuba and demanded that the USSR remove the missiles from the island. In response, the Soviet Union threatened the use of force, and the world found itself on the brink of nuclear war. Ultimately, the crisis was resolved through secret negotiations between Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, during which the USSR agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public promise from the U.S. not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The aftermath and conclusion of Operation Mongoose. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, Operation Mongoose was effectively dismantled. Despite its limited success and the failure of many of its objectives, the operation highlighted the complexity and danger of intervening in another country's affairs, especially when global geopolitical interests were at stake. In the long run, Operation Mongoose became an example of how tensions between great powers can lead to the use of covert methods of intervention, which do not always achieve the desired result. Cuba, despite U.S. efforts, remained under Fidel Castro's control, who managed to maintain his independence and even strengthen his power after the crisis.